The air smelled of rain and regret in Willow Creek, a small town where secrets grew like weeds in untended gardens. Eleanor Grayson, 70 years old, stood on the creaking porch of her two-story Victorian home, her hands trembling not from age but from the letter she'd found tucked in her mailbox. It was a crisp, official document, stamped with the seal of a real estate company she'd never heard of, informing her that her house, her sanctuary of 50 years, was scheduled for sale in 2 weeks. The words blurred before her eyes, not because of her failing vision, but because of the betrayal they carried. Someone close, had orchestrated this behind her back. Eleanor's life had been stitched into this house. Every scuff on the hardwood floors, every chip in the pale blue paint, told a story. She and her late husband, Thomas, had bought it in their 20s, back when Willow Creek was just a scattering of farms and dreams. They'd raised their daughter, Margaret, here, watched her take her first steps in the living room, and later, waved her off to college from the same porch where Eleanor now stood. Thomas had passed a decade ago, leaving Eleanor to tend the house alone. But it was hers, paid off, cherished, a living monument to their love. And now, someone wanted to rip it away. She clutched the letter tighter, her knuckles widening. The signature at the bottom was unfamiliar, but the intent was clear. Someone had forged her name, her consent, her life. Her first thought was Margaret. Her daughter had grown distant over the years, her visits dwindling to perfunctory holiday calls. But Margaret wouldn't dare. Would she? Eleanor's heart thudded, a mix of fear and fury. She'd raised her daughter to value family, to honor promises. But greed had a way of twisting even the best hearts. The town was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that carried whispers of trouble. Eleanor walked back inside, her steps deliberate despite the ache in her knees. The living room smelled of lavender and old books, a comfort that now felt like a taunt. She sat at the oak dining table, spreading the letter flat, and began to piece together the puzzle. The real estate company, Crestwood Properties, was based in the next town over. She didn't know them, but she knew Willow Creek's grapevine would. Tomorrow, she'd start asking questions. Tonight, she needed to steady herself. Eleanor wasn't one to crumble. She'd survived Lost Thomas's death, the slow drift of friends moving away or passing on, the creeping loneliness of age. But this was a violation, a theft not just of property, but of her dignity. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling like a ghost, and let her mind wander back to the early days in this house. She and Thomas had scraped by, planting roses in the garden, laughing over burnt dinners in the kitchen. They dreamed of growing old here, and she had kept that promise, even after he was gone. This house wasn't just walls and windows. It was her anchor, her proof that she'd lived a life worth living. The phone rang, shattering her thoughts. It was too late for casual calls. She hesitated, then picked up. Hello? Mom. Margaret's voice, clipped and nervous, came through. I just wanted to check on you. Eleanor's grip tightened on the receiver. Margaret rarely called unprompted, and the timing felt wrong, like a chess move made too soon. I'm fine, Eleanor said, her tone measured. Just got an interesting letter today. About the house. Silence stretched on the other end, heavy and telling. What letter? Margaret finally asked, her voice a shade too high. From a real estate company. Says the house is up for sale. Funny, since I never put it on the market. Eleanor let the words hang, sharp and deliberate. Margaret stammered. That must be a mistake. I'll look into it. Okay. Don't worry. Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. The quiver in her daughter's voice was enough to confirm her suspicions. Margaret was involved, or at least knew more than she was letting on. Eleanor hung up, her heart sinking but her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for the truth. The next morning, Eleanor dressed in her best navy skirt and blouse, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She walked to the town square, where the local diner, Millie's, served as the hub of gossip. Millie herself, a wiry woman in her 60s, greeted Eleanor with a warm smile that faltered when she saw the letter in Eleanor's hand. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Millie asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Eleanor slid the letter across the counter. "Someone's trying to sell my house. Millie, without my say-so." Millie's eyes widened as she scanned the document. Crestwood Properties. Never heard of them. But I heard some folks at the bank talking about a big developer sniffing around town. Want me to ask around? Eleanor nodded. Discreetly. I need to know who's behind this. By noon, Millie had a name, Daniel Harper, a slick real estate agent who'd been cozying up to Willow Creek's younger crowd, including Margaret's husband, Greg. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Greg, with his flashy car and big talk about investments, had always rubbed her the wrong way. Could he and Margaret be desperate enough to betray her like this? Eleanor spent the afternoon at the library, digging through public records on the library's ancient computer. She found Crestwood Properties filings nothing unusual, just a small firm with a history of flipping old homes for profit. But one detail caught her eye, a co-signer on the sale agreement for her house, listed as Margaret Grayson Harper. Her daughter's name, in black and white, felt like a slap. Eleanor printed the page, her hand steady now, fueled by a fire she hadn't felt in years. She returned home as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across her garden. The roses, Thomas's pride, still bloomed, defiant against the coming autumn. Eleanor sat on the porch swing, the printed page in her lap, and made a decision. She wouldn't confront Margaret yet. She needed proof, not just suspicions. And she needed allies. Willow Creek was small, but its people were loyal to their own. If she could rally them, she could stop this sale and make sure whoever was behind it paid a price. That night, Eleanor drafted a letter of her own, not to the real estate company, but to the town's historical society. Her house, with its Victorian charm and century-old foundation, might qualify for protected status. It was a long shot, but it was a start. She sealed the envelope, her heart pounding with purpose. They thought they could take her home, her memories, her life. They were about to learn how fiercely an old woman could fight. Eleanor woke to the sound of birdsong, a familiar melody that usually soothed her, but today felt like a call to battle. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. The letter to the Historical Society was a first step, but she needed to move fast. Crestwood Properties wasn't going to wait, and neither could she. She dressed in a crisp white blouse and her favorite cardigan, the one Thomas had bought her for their 40th anniversary, and headed to the Historical Society's office in the town hall. The Society's president, Clara Thompson, was a wiry woman in her late 50s with a passion for preserving Willow Creek's past. She welcomed Eleanor with a cup of coffee and a curious glance at the folder Eleanor carried. "What's this about, Ellie?" Clara asked, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. Eleanor laid out the situation: the letter, the forged signature, the involvement of Crestwood Properties, and Margaret's name on the documents. Clara's face darkened as she listened, her fingers tapping the desk. "This house of yours, it's got history," Clara said. "Built in 1890. Right. Original woodwork. Stained glass in the upstairs window. If we can get it designated as a historic property, no one can touch it without a fight. Eleanor nodded, hope flickering. How long would that take? Weeks. Maybe a month. Clara replied. But we can file for a temporary injunction to stall the sale while we process the application. You got any proof this sale's fishy? Eleanor slid the printed page from the library across the desk. My daughter's name. On a document I never approved. And I'm betting Greg, her husband, isn't on it too. Clara whistled low. That's bold. Even for Greg Harper. I'll get the paperwork started. You talk to anyone else in town? I'm working on it, Eleanor said. Millie's got her ear to the ground at the diner. I'm heading to the bank next. They might know something about Crestwood's dealings. The bank was a short walk, but every step felt heavier with the weight of betrayal. Eleanor had always trusted Margaret, even when their relationship grew strained. Margaret had been a bright, curious child, but money and Greg's ambitions had changed her. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder where she'd gone wrong as a mother. Had she been too soft, too trusting? Or was it just life, pulling people apart like threads in an old sweater? At the bank, Eleanor met with Tom Whitaker, a longtime friend who'd managed her accounts since Thomas's passing. Tom's face paled when she showed him the letter. Ellie, I heard rumors about a developer eyeing Willow Creek for condos, but I didn't know your place was involved. Let me check the records. Tom disappeared into the back, returning with a stack of papers. Crestwood Properties took out a loan last month, secured against your property. Greg Harper's listed as a guarantor. They're betting big on this deal, too big, if you ask me. Eleanor's heart sank, but her resolve didn't waver. Can you freeze anything tied to my house? Tom hesitated. I can flag the account for review, but you'll need a lawyer to stop this legally. I know someone, Rebecca Lang. She's sharp and doesn't back down. Want me to call her? Do it, Eleanor said. She left the bank with a fire in her chest, a mix of anger and determination. Greg and Margaret thought they could sell her home out from under her, but they'd underestimated her. She wasn't just an old woman. She was a force, rooted in this town like the oak in her backyard. That afternoon, Eleanor met Rebecca Lang at Millie's diner. Rebecca, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as Eleanor recounted the story. You've got a strong case for fraud, Rebecca said, scribbling notes. The forged signature alone is enough to halt the sale, but we'll need to prove it's Margaret or Greg's doing. Can you get me anything else? Emails, texts, anything tying them to Crestwood? Eleanor shook her head. Not yet, but I will. Rebecca nodded. Start with Margaret. Confront her, but don't tip your hand too much. Record the conversation if you can. Check local laws, but I think Willow Creek allows it with one-party consent. Eleanor spent the evening preparing. She called Margaret, her voice calm but firm. I need you to come over tomorrow. Margaret, we have to talk about the house. Margaret hesitated, then agreed, her voice tight. Sure, Mom. I'll be there. The next morning, Margaret arrived, her face a mask of forced cheer. Greg wasn't with her, which Eleanor noted with a pang of suspicion. They sat in the living room, sunlight streaming through the stained glass window, casting colorful patterns on the floor. Eleanor didn't waste time. Margaret, I know about the sale. I know your name's on the papers. Why? Margaret's face crumpled, but only for a moment. It's not what you think, Mom. Greg said it was an investment opportunity, a way to secure our future. The house, it's just sitting here. And you thought you'd sell my home without asking me. Eleanor's voice was low, but it carried the weight of years. This isn't just a house. Margaret, it's my life. Your father's life. Your childhood. How could you? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But Eleanor saw something else: guilt. Yes, but also defiance. We're drowning in debt. Mom. Greg's business went under. And we thought you'd be better off in a smaller place. Somewhere easier to manage. Eleanor's heart twisted. But she kept her voice steady. And you didn't think to talk to me. You forged my name. Margaret. That's not love. That's theft. Margaret stood, her hands shaking. I didn't want this. Okay. It was Greg's idea. He said it was the only way. Eleanor watched her daughter leave, the door slamming behind her. She felt hollow, but not broken. Margaret's words confirmed what she'd feared. Greg was the mastermind. But Margaret had gone along with it. Eleanor pulled out her phone, where she'd recorded the conversation, and sent it to Rebecca. It wasn't enough to win yet, but it was a start. Back at the Historical Society, Clara called with good news. The injunction was filed, temporarily halting the sale. But Crestwood was pushing back, claiming they had a valid contract. Eleanor knew the fight was far from over. She sat on her porch that night, the stars bright above Willow Creek, and made a vow. She'd protect her home, no matter the cost. And if Greg and Margaret thought they could outsmart her, they were about to learn just how deep her roots ran in this town. The days blurred into a rhythm of strategy and resolve for Eleanor. Willow Creek's tight-knit community began to rally around her, whispers of her plight spreading like wildfire. At Millie's Diner, locals lingered longer over coffee, offering support and snippets of information. Old Mr. Jenkins, who'd once been town mayor, stopped by Eleanor's porch with a tip. Crestwood Properties had been meeting with developers at the old mill, planning a condo project that would swallow half the town's historic homes. Eleanor's house, with its prime location and charm, was their crown jewel. Eleanor met with Rebecca Lang again, this time at her law office, a small space cluttered with legal books and framed photos of Willow Creek's past. Rebecca had reviewed the recorded conversation with Margaret. It's damning, she said, but we need more to prove fraud in court. Can you get into Greg's emails or phone? Anything tying him directly to Crestwood? Eleanor shook her head. I'm not tech-savvy, Rebecca, but I know someone who is. She thought of Tim, Millie's grandson, a college kid home for the summer who'd fixed her ancient computer more than once. Tim was sharp, with a knack for digging up digital dirt. Eleanor called him, and by evening, he was at her house, his laptop glowing in the dim light of her dining room. Mrs. Grayson, I can't hack anything that's illegal, Tim said, pushing up his glasses. But if you've got access to Greg's computer or phone, I can show you how to look for evidence. Eleanor frowned. He's not likely to hand me his phone. But he and Margaret are coming over tomorrow for dinner. They think I'm softening, that I'll agree to sell. Tim grinned. Perfect. If he leaves his phone unattended, you could check it. I'll show you what to look for: mails, texts, anything with Crestwood's name. The dinner was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Margaret sat stiffly, picking at her roast chicken, while Greg talked too loudly about his new business ventures. Eleanor played along, her smile tight but convincing. When Greg excused himself to the bathroom, his phone stayed on the table, screen unlocked. Eleanor's heart raced. She glanced at Margaret, who was staring out the window, and slipped the phone to Tim, who'd been invited under the pretense of helping with dessert. Tim worked fast, his fingers flying over the screen. Got something, he whispered. showing Eleanor a text thread between Greg and a man named Daniel Harper. Eleanor recognized the name from Millie's tip. The texts were blunt. Grayson House is a gold mine. Push the sale through before the old lady catches on. Another message from Greg read, Margaret's on board, but she's nervous. Keep her name off the final papers. Eleanor's blood boiled, but she kept her composure. She returned the phone before Greg came back, her mind racing. Tim emailed the screenshots to Rebecca, who promised to use them in court. But Eleanor wasn't content to wait for legal battles. She wanted to hit back now, to show Greg and Crestwood that Willow Creek wasn't their playground. The next day, Eleanor organized a town meeting at the community center. She stood at the podium, her voice steady despite the crowd's murmurs. My home, our town's history is under threat, she said, holding up the real estate letter. Crestwood Properties thinks they can buy us out, tear down our homes for condos. They forged my signature, and I'm not the only one they're targeting. The room erupted in gasps and angry whispers. Mr. Jenkins stood, his voice booming. My family's farm is next on their list. I found a similar letter last week. Others chimed in. Mrs. Lopez, whose bakery was at risk. The Wilsons, whose cottage was being eyed for demolition. Eleanor had ignited a spark, and it was spreading. By the end of the meeting, the town had formed a coalition to fight Crestwood. Clara from the Historical Society promised to expedite historic designations for multiple properties, while Rebecca offered pro bono legal advice to anyone targeted. Eleanor felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was Willow Creek's. But the victory was bittersweet. Margaret hadn't shown up to the meeting, and Eleanor's calls went unanswered. She drove to her daughter's small rental on the edge of town, her heart heavy. Margaret opened the door, her eyes red from crying. Mom, I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know it would go this far. Eleanor wanted to forgive her, but the wound was too fresh. You chose Greg over me, she said softly. You chose money over our home. Margaret sobbed, but Eleanor didn't stay. She drove back to her house, the lights warm against the dusk. The fight was far from over, but she had the town behind her and evidence that could bury Greg and Crestwood. She sat at her dining table, the same one where she'd raised Margaret, and began drafting a letter to the local newspaper. It was time to tell Willow Creek's story, to expose the greed threatening their homes. Eleanor's pen moved with purpose, each word a brick in the wall she was building to protect her legacy. Eleanor's letter to the Willow Creek Gazette hit like a thunderclap. By morning, copies were in every diner, shop, and mailbox. The headline bold, Developers Target Historic Homes in Secret Sale Scheme. The article detailed Eleanor's story, the forged signature, and Crestwood's plans for condos, backed by quotes from Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Lopez. It didn't name Margaret or Greg directly. Eleanor had insisted on that, still clinging to a thread of hope for her daughter, but the town knew. Whispers followed Greg when he stopped for gas, and Margaret stopped answering her door. Eleanor didn't revel in their shame. Her focus was on the fight. The Historical Society's injunction had bought time, but Crestwood was doubling down, sending lawyers to pressure the town council. Rebecca warned that the developers had deep pockets and deeper connections. They're not just fighting for your house, Ellie, she said. They want to set a precedent. If they win here, no old home in Willow Creek is safe. Eleanor spent her days rallying the coalition. She and Clara organized a petition, gathering signatures from nearly every household in town. Millie turned her diner into a hub for strategy sessions, where locals planned protests and drafted letters to state officials. Even Tim, the tech-savvy kid, built a website to spread the word. complete with photos of Willow Creek's historic homes and stories of their families. The site went viral in the county, drawing attention from preservation groups and even a few reporters from the city. But the pressure was wearing on Eleanor. Nights were the hardest, when the house felt too big, too quiet. She'd walk the halls, touching the banister Thomas had carved, the wallpaper they'd chosen together. Memories flooded her: Margaret's laughter as a child, Thomas's voice reading bedtime stories. How had it come to this? She didn't hate Margaret. Not really. But the betrayal cut deeper than any loss she'd faced. One evening, Rebecca called with urgent news. "We've got a hearing in 2 days. Crestwood's pushing to lift the injunction, claiming the sale contract is valid. We need to present the forged signature evidence and the texts from Greg's phone. Can you testify?" Eleanor's stomach knotted. Testifying meant facing Margaret and Greg in court, exposing their betrayal publicly. But she nodded. "I'll do it." The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a stern brick building that felt cold despite the summer heat. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Margaret and Greg were there, sitting apart, their faces pale. Daniel Harper, the real estate agent, sat with Crestwood's lawyers, his smug smile grating on Eleanor's nerves. Rebecca presented the evidence methodically: the forged signature, the texts, the loan documents tying Greg to Crestwood. Eleanor took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted finding the letter, discovering Margaret's involvement, and learning of Greg's scheme. The judge, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair, listened intently, her eyes softening when Eleanor spoke of the house's history, her life with Thomas, the memories embedded in its walls. When it was Crestwood's turn, their lawyer argued that Eleanor was confused, too old to manage her property, and that Margaret had acted in her best interest. Eleanor's blood boiled, but she kept her composure, letting Rebecca counter with evidence of fraud. Margaret was called to testify, and Eleanor braced herself. Her daughter's voice trembled as she admitted signing the papers, claiming she thought it was what Eleanor wanted. It was a weak lie, and the courtroom saw through it. The judge adjourned for deliberation, leaving Eleanor drained but resolute. Outside, the townspeople gathered, holding signs that read, "Save Willow Creek's homes," and "Note agreed." Their support buoyed her, but Margaret's tearful glance as she left the courthouse pierced her heart. Eleanor wanted to reach out, to fix things, but the gap between them felt too wide. That night, Eleanor found a letter slipped under her door. It was from Margaret, handwritten and smudged with tears. "Mom, I was wrong. Greg convinced me we'd lose everything if we didn't sell. I thought I was helping, but I betrayed you. I'm leaving him. I don't know how to make this right, but I want to try." Eleanor read it twice, her emotions a tangle of hurt and hope. She didn't reply, not yet. She needed time. The next day, the judge ruled in Eleanor's favor, declaring the sale contract invalid due to fraud. The injunction would hold until the Historical Society's application was processed. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Eleanor felt no triumph, only relief. She'd saved her home, but at what cost? Margaret was unraveling. Greg's reputation was in tatters, and Crestwood was already sniffing around other properties. The fight wasn't over, but Eleanor had struck a blow. She walked home, the town's cheers echoing in her ears, and sat on her porch, the weight of victory heavy but real. The victory in court was a spark, but Eleanor knew sparks could fade if not tended. Crestwood Properties wasn't done. They'd lost her house, but their sights were still set on Willow Creek. The town's coalition grew stronger, fueled by the Gazette article and the courthouse win. Eleanor became an unlikely leader, her silver hair and quiet strength a symbol of resistance. But leadership came with a price. She hadn't spoken to Margaret since the hearing, and the silence gnawed at her. Eleanor threw herself into the fight. She and Clara worked tirelessly on the historical designation, gathering photos, blueprints, and stories about her house and others in town. The State Preservation Board was impressed, scheduling a site visit in a week. Meanwhile, Rebecca uncovered more dirt on Crestwood. They'd been buying up loans from struggling families, using debt as leverage to force sales. Greg, it turned out, wasn't just a player was in debt to Crestwood himself. His failed business ventures leaving him desperate. Tim's website became a rallying point, drawing support from preservationists across the state. A local news channel picked up the story, filming Eleanor on her porch, her voice steady as she spoke of Willow Creek's heritage. "This isn't just about my house," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "It's about our town, our history, our right to stay." The segment aired on a Sunday night, and by Monday, donations poured in for legal fees and preservation efforts. But the personal cost lingered. Eleanor found Margaret's letter again, tucked in a drawer, and read it until the words blurred. She wanted to forgive her daughter, to rebuild what they'd lost. But trust was a fragile thing. She called Margaret, leaving a voicemail. "I'm ready to talk when you are. But it's going to take time." It was all she could offer for now. The Preservation Board's visit was a turning point. The inspectors, a pair of academics with a love for Victorian architecture, marveled at Eleanor's home, the original woodwork, the stained glass window, the roses Thomas had planted. "This house is a gem," one said, scribbling notes. "If the rest of Willow Creek is like this, you've got a strong case for a historic district." That evening, the town threw a celebration at Millie's Diner, toasting to the hope of saving their homes. Eleanor stood at the center, her heart full but heavy. She raised a glass of lemonade, her voice carrying over the chatter. "To Willow Creek," she said. "To our homes, our memories, and the fight we'll keep fighting." The room cheered, but Eleanor's eyes searched for Margaret, who wasn't there. Days later, Margaret showed up at Eleanor's door, unannounced. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. "I left Greg," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's moving out of town. Crestwood dropped him when the sale fell through. He can't afford rent here anymore." Eleanor's heart twisted anger, pity, and love all at once. "And you?" she asked. Margaret looked away. "I'm staying. I want to make things right. Mom, I know I messed up, but I want to help with the house, with the town, with us." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She led Margaret inside, to the kitchen where they'd once baked cookies together. They sat in silence, the weight of years between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "You hurt me, Margaret, but you're my daughter. We'll figure this out, one step at a time." The next week, the Preservation Board granted temporary historic status to Eleanor's house and 3 others, with more pending. Crestwood's plans stalled, their investors pulling back as the town's resistance grew. Eleanor and Margaret began to rebuild, slowly, through small acts, Margaret helping in the garden, Eleanor teaching her the history of each rose. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Eleanor stood on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. The house was safe, for now, but the fight had changed her. She'd found a strength she hadn't known she had, a voice that carried beyond her years. And she'd found her town, a family bigger than she'd imagined. The battle wasn't over, but Eleanor was ready for Crestwood, for Margaret, for whatever came next. The seasons turned in Willow Creek. and Eleanor's house stood firm, its roses blooming brighter as if to defy the developer's greed. The historic designation was finalized, protecting not just Eleanor's home but a dozen others, creating a historic district that Crestwood couldn't touch. The town's coalition, now a formal organization, continued to monitor developers, ensuring no one else faced what Eleanor had. But for Eleanor, the victory was more than legal, it was personal. Margaret moved back to Willow Creek, renting a small apartment near Millie's diner. She joined the coalition, using her accounting skills to manage their funds, a quiet way of making amends. Their relationship was still fragile, like a cracked vase glued back together. But it held. They spent evenings together, sorting through old photos, laughing over memories of Thomas, rebuilding trust one story at a time. Eleanor learned to forgive, not because Margaret deserved it yet, but because holding on to anger was too heavy a burden. Greg, meanwhile, was a ghost in Willow Creek. After Crestwood dropped him, he tried to stay, but the town's cold shoulder and his mounting debts drove him away. The last Eleanor heard, he was in a city somewhere, scraping by. She didn't wish him ill, but she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he'd reaped what he'd sown. Crestwood itself scaled back, their condo project scrapped after investors fled, spooked by the bad press and legal battles. Eleanor became a local legend, her story told at Millie's, in the Gazette, even in nearby towns. She didn't see herself that way, she was just a woman who'd fought for her home. But the townspeople's gratitude warmed her. From the free coffee Millie slipped her to the kids, who waved as they passed her house. Willow Creek had changed, not just in its laws, but in its spirit. Neighbors checked on each other, shared stories of their homes, and stood together against outsiders who saw their town as a quick profit. One crisp autumn day, Eleanor and Margaret sat on the porch, sipping tea as the leaves fell. The house glowed in the late light, its windows catching the sun like eyes full of secrets. "I used to think this place was just a house," Margaret said, her voice soft. "But it's more. It's you, Mom. It's Dad. It's us." Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on Margaret's. "It's ours," she said. "And it's Willow Creek's. That's why I fought." The coalition threw a festival to celebrate the historic district, with music, food, and tours of the protected homes. Eleanor's was the star, its doors open to neighbors who marveled at the life it held. She walked them through the rooms, telling stories of Thomas's laughter, Margaret's childhood, the years of love and loss. The townspeople listened, their faces lit with pride, and Eleanor felt Thomas's presence in the warmth of their smiles. As the festival ended, Eleanor stood alone in her garden, the roses heavy with dew. She thought of the letter that had started it all, the betrayal that had nearly broken her, and the strength she'd found to fight back. She'd saved her home, her town, and, in a way, her daughter. The cost had been high, trust shattered. Years of pain, but the reward was this moment. This life. This home. Eleanor looked up at the stars, the same ones she and Thomas had watched decades ago. "We did it," she whispered, her voice steady. The house creaked behind her, as if in agreement, and Eleanor knew she'd never be alone here. Willow Creek was her family. Her house was her heart, and no one, not greed, not betrayal, could take that away.